By mid-1945, the Pacific War was in its final, brutal act. The Japanese Empire was collapsing, not in sudden defeat, but in slow, grinding ruin. Its navy lay shattered beneath the waves, its cities burned by relentless air raids, and its once proud merchant fleet was nearly erased from the seas. But Japan refused to surrender. Across the islands and coastlines of the Pacific, soldiers dug in, civilians drilled with bamboo spears, and every mile of territory was prepared to bleed before it broke. For the Americans, it was a war that demanded not just force, but ingenuity. That ingenuity lived beneath the waves. By 1945, the U.S. submarine force was the silent spear point of America's Pacific campaign, just 6% of the Navy's manpower, yet responsible for sinking over half of Japan's merchant tonnage. They strangled the empire's lifelines: oil from the Dutch East Indies, food from the South, and steel from Manchuria. Without these, Japan's war machine starved in silence, but the job was dangerous. Every dive was a brush with death, from depth charges, mines, and mechanical failure. And yet one submarine had risen above the rest, carving a name whispered with respect and awe: USS Barb, SS-220. Commissioned in 1942, Barb had already become legendary by the war's later years. She had prowled the waters off China, the Philippines, and the Sea of Okhotsk, striking Japanese convoys with uncanny precision. But it wasn't just her success that made her famous. It was the man who commanded her, Commander Eugene Fluckey. A graduate of the Naval Academy's class of 1935, Fluckey wasn't just skilled. He was fearless, imaginative, and relentlessly driven. His crew adored him, not because he was soft, but because he was bold. He treated every patrol like a challenge to outthink and outmaneuver an enemy who had long underestimated American submariners. Fluckey believed that surprise and daring were the deadliest weapons of all. He once said, "We didn't have time to be scared. We had a job to do, and I wanted to do it better than anyone else." When he took command of Barb in early 1944, the submarine's luck and legend changed overnight. During her patrols off the Chinese coast, Fluckey led Barb on a series of record-breaking attacks. On one daring night, she penetrated a heavily guarded harbor in Namquan, China, and unleashed torpedoes at anchored ships, sinking multiple freighters before escaping under the blaze of burning oil. The attack was so audacious that many in the Navy thought it impossible. For that action, Fluckey earned the Medal of Honor, and Barb earned a reputation as a ghost that struck where no submarine should ever be. But even glory fades against the rhythm of war. By summer 1945, Japan's remaining supply lines ran closer to home, along its own coasts and islands. And with the Pacific nearly conquered, the Navy's submarines were ordered to hunt ever closer to the Japanese homeland. It was here, amid fog, minefields, and patrol aircraft, that Barb found herself again on the hunt. Fluckey was restless. He knew the war was nearly over, but he also knew that complacency killed. If the Japanese believed they were safe near their shores, he intended to prove them wrong. On Barb's 12th war patrol, Fluckey led his men toward the northern island of Karafuto, then part of the Japanese Empire. Their mission: disrupt what little supply traffic remained. They attacked coastal shipping, shelled factories and fishing boats, and harassed convoys in shallow waters that no submarine dared enter. But Fluckey wanted something different, something symbolic. He had heard reports of a railway line running along the coast, carrying military materials to the ports. If they could destroy that line, not from the air, not from the sea, but by hand, it would send a message across Japan's shores. Nowhere was safe, not even home. And so, as the USS Barb floated in the cold waters off Karafuto that July night, the idea of an impossible mission began to take shape, one that would turn a submarine into a land raider. The concept was unprecedented, risky, and almost absurd. But to Fluckey, that was exactly why it had to be done. The idea did not arrive fully formed. It grew piece by piece like a map sketched in the fog. Fluckey and his officers watched the coast at night and noted one stubborn fact: trains still moved. Freight and equipment still crawled along rails hugging the shoreline. Every car was a small lifeline. Every locomotive a target. Destroy a train and you choke a route, even if only for a day. There was also practicality in the absurd. By July 1945, Barb had fired much of her torpedo load, and expended many of the weapons that made a submarine a blunt instrument. But Barb still carried scuttling charges, sizable demolition devices intended to sink a submarine in extremis. Fluckey found a different use for them. He proposed adapting those charges into a rail demolition, jury-rigging a trigger that would detonate under the weight of a passing train. It was a crude physics trick. It was also brilliant. Planning began in whispers. No paper trails that enemies could find. No formal briefings that could leak ashore. Fluckey chose volunteers from among men he trusted, sailors who were steady with a seamanship oar and steady with a nervous laugh in the dark. They trained quietly on Barb's deck and in the cramped confines of her conning tower, rehearsing launches, beach approaches, and silent paddles in rubber boats pulled from the sub's davits. The chosen demolition squad would number 8, petty officers and enlisted men, and 1 officer to lead them ashore. Those men were ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in resolve. Chief Gunner's Mate Paul G. Saunders, Electrician's Mate Billy R. Hatfield, Signalman Francis N. Sever, Ship's Cook Lawrence W. Newland, Torpedoman's Mate Edward W. Klingesmith, Motor Machinists James E. Richard and John Markison, and Lieutenant William M. Walker. Each volunteered despite the stakes. Each understood that once they stepped onto Carafuto soil, they would be criminals in enemy eyes, saboteurs with little hope of rescue should their extraction fail. The technical problem was simpler on paper than in reality. The scuttling charge weighed roughly 50-odd pounds and had no factory timer for a passing train. Fluckey's men modified the detonator. They fashioned a pressure switch and a crude circuit so that when the iron wheels completed the connection across the rails, the charge would see a path to ground and fire. Other teams tested the rig on Barb's docked gear. They practiced under lamplight until the mechanism behaved predictably. The ingenuity was equal parts mechanical skill and improvisation, the kind of tradecraft learned in mess halls and machine shops rather than classrooms. Intelligence mattered. A Japanese prisoner taken earlier in the patrol provided useful details about the local beach patrols, where they walked, where sentries paused, when the trains ran fastest. Fluckey used that human intelligence to choose a landing at night close enough to reach the line, but far enough to avoid small-town lights. The submarine would close to within a few hundred yards of shore to minimize the rowers' time in open water. If the party was delayed, the plan had a hard limit. Barb would submerge before dawn to avoid detection by aircraft. The margin for error was measured in minutes. Morale and psychology were important parts of the plan. Fluckey knew a blow to a railway would be more than physical damage. It would be a story, one that sailors ashore, factory hands, and radio listeners would all pass along. A submarine landing on the home islands and destroying a train would shake confidence. It would force a mental reallocation of Japanese resources toward guarding their own soil. That ripple, Fluckey believed, was worth the risk. His crew agreed. They wanted to prove that the sea could spawn more than torpedoes. It could spawn shock and awe of a different sort. On the night of July 22nd, Barb slipped into position. The crew lowered rubber boats in near silence. Men double-checked straps, tightened hoods, and slipped their oars into black water. Fluckey watched the shoreline through his binoculars, a silhouette of rocks and shadowed tree lines. He briefed the landing party once more in the hush of the conning tower, reached the track, placed the charge, set the switch, and returned to the rendezvous point. No heroics, no delay. The sub would only wait until the first pale thread of dawn. There was inevitability in the risk. Near the end of a long war, men often chose the hard, improbable tasks that others would not. Fluckey's raid was that kind of act. Small in manpower, enormous in audacity. The technical jury-rigging, the stolen intelligence, the quiet courage of 8 volunteers. All of it converged on a single, fragile hinge. The moment when rubber would kiss sand and men would step from ocean into enemy land. The success of the plan would depend on timing, silence, and the stubborn luck that fortune sometimes grants to the daring. Inside a submarine, courage looks different. It isn't the loud kind. It's the quiet, suffocating patience of men who live surrounded by steel, depth, and darkness. On the USS Barb, bravery was measured in heartbeats held during depth charge attacks, in the silent exchange of glances when gauges trembled near the red line. The men of Barb had endured this for months. They had seen comrades lost, ships crushed, and entire convoys turned to oil and flame. Yet what kept them steady wasn't just discipline. It was a peculiar kind of brotherhood. They were trapped together in a world where every man's breath depended on another's calm. By the summer of 1945, they were veterans of 11 patrols. They had survived near misses, mechanical breakdowns, and nights when enemy destroyers raked the sea above them. The tension had welded them together. When Fluckey asked for volunteers to land on Japan's coast, no one hesitated. They understood that this was not a duty ordered. It was one chosen. Most of them were barely in their 20s. One was a cook, another an electrician. None were trained commandos. Yet their resolve was pure, a mixture of exhaustion, defiance, and quiet pride. They knew the war was nearing its end, and this mission wasn't about medals or revenge. It was about finishing well. In those final months, when so many just waited for the last orders of peace, these 8 men chose risk over rest. They wanted to leave behind proof that even at the end, when war's noise faded, courage still mattered. Technology shaped the war, but in the Pacific, it was the submarine that became the unseen evolution of power. By 1945, American subs like the Barb were no longer just torpedo platforms. They were stealth machines of precision, reconnaissance, and adaptability. The Barb herself was a Gato-class submarine, 311 feet long, powered by 4 diesel engines and 4 electric motors. She could dive to over 300 feet, though her crew had pushed her beyond that limit when hunted. Her radar and sonar were state-of-the-art for their time, giving Fluckey the advantage of sight in a war fought mostly in darkness. But her true weapon was flexibility. Barb carried a 5-inch deck gun, machine guns, and even rocket launchers mounted experimentally on her last patrols, a first for U.S. submarines. This made her capable of coastal harassment and surface strikes, blurring the lines between undersea hunter and guerrilla warship. Fluckey used every innovation he could. He had Barb's radar tuned to detect not just ships, but trains running along coastal tracks, the metal wheels giving a faint, distinct signature on the radar screen. It was how he first confirmed the location of his target on Carafudo. The technical challenge of the land raid showed how far adaptability had come. Submariners were not trained engineers of sabotage, yet within days they devised a trigger that converted a naval charge into a rail bomb, using a micro-switch, salvaged wire, and a jury-rigged battery from Barb's stores. They created a mechanism that was small, waterproof, and deadly. It was improvised warfare at its peak, the kind that defined the closing months of WW2. Machines could be built by factories, but ingenuity could only come from the men who fought them. Leadership in war often balances 2 weights, responsibility and imagination. Commander Eugene B. Fluckey carried both in equal measure. To his men he was Lucky Fluckey, not because he believed in luck, but because his daring plans somehow always worked. He had a mind that refused to stay within regulation. He questioned routines, rewrote procedures, and believed that fear could be turned into focus. Fluckey was known for leading from the front, not from comfort, but conviction. He made decisions quickly, yet never recklessly. When he proposed the land raid, his officers initially thought it a joke. No submarine captain had ever ordered men to go ashore in Japan. But as he laid out the plan, tide charts, patrol intervals, moonlight angles, and extraction windows, skepticism turned into quiet trust. He understood something that separated great commanders from cautious ones. Audacity requires precision. Every bold act had to be balanced by perfect execution. He spent nights studying currents, coastline maps, and train schedules obtained from intercepted transmissions. His philosophy was simple: the enemy must never dictate the terms of battle. If they guarded the seas, he would strike from the land. If they guarded the land, he would strike from the sea. Fluckey's genius wasn't in aggression alone, but in control. He pushed his men to extremes, yet ensured they believed in the mission's purpose. His calm confidence disarmed fear. Before the raid, he told his crew with typical understatement, "Boys, tonight we're going to make a little noise on their own ground." That tone, light, deliberate, almost playful, hid the weight of what he was asking them to do. And they followed him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Under Fluckey, Barb became more than a warship. It became a symbol of how creativity, courage, and leadership could bend even the logic of war itself. As the tide of July 23rd began to pull toward shore, that same leadership would transform planning into motion. The Barb's 8 volunteers were ready. Their equipment was packed. The engines were silent. The night was about to decide whether Fluckey's daring would become history or legend. From Tokyo to small coastal towns, Japanese defenses in mid-1945 were a study in contradiction. The Empire still poured manpower into trenches, coastal batteries, and air patrols, yet resources were stretched thin and priorities conflicted. Many commanders feared invasion by fleets and airborne assaults. Fewer imagined the sea itself could carry saboteurs ashore. Coastal units were often local conscripts, reservists, and neighborhood militia, men charged with watching beaches, reporting small craft, and keeping an eye on any unusual lights at night. Their training varied. Their equipment was often scarce. Where once modern garrisons patrolled, now worn uniforms and tired dogs marked the line between land and sea. These watchmen scanned horizons for warships, not for silently approaching rubber boats. Air patrols flew irregularly, and radar coverage near remote stretches of coastline was incomplete. The Japanese believed their railways ran inland behind layers of defense, that the iron arteries were protected by distance and the difficulty of landing men undetected. That assumption was the flaw Fluckey planned to exploit. If the enemy feared invasions that never came, they left precisely the gap that a submarine could find and squeeze through. When saboteurs did arrive, they were not treated like conventional prisoners of war. Under Japanese law at the time, men captured conducting sabotage on home soil could be executed as spies. That harsh reality hung over the mission like a blade. Every volunteer knew that capture would mean not just death, but a deliberate public punishment meant to deter others. Yet the Japanese system of counter-sabotage lacked reach at night along seldom-watched stretches of rail. Local police might respond late. Coastal guards might miss an intrusion entirely. That brittle line of defense became the mission's opening. Tactically, the raid depended on geometry, distance, darkness, and the precise choreography of men and machine. The submarine's role was twofold: deliver the team as close as possible and provide the clock that would force action before dawn. Barb's plan minimized exposure. Approaching to a few hundred yards offshore reduced the time the rowers spent in open water. The rubber boats were nearly invisible at night. Their only sound was the soft scrape of oars. The landing site was chosen for its low profile, a narrow crescent of sand backed by scrub and small dunes, with the railway line skirting the cliffs a short sprint inland. The approach avoided village lights and any conspicuous landmarks that might reveal escape paths or call attention. Once ashore, the party had to move fast and silent. Boots on pebbled sand make a soft racket if you know how to walk, but every rustle risked alerting a nearby sentry. The men drilled for moments like this: how to cross a strand of sharp gravel without a noise, how to read the dark for rabbit trails and drainage ditches, how to set a charge without a flashlight. Their rehearsals on the submarine had been meticulous because at sea the margin for improvisation was almost nil. The explosive device itself was a lesson in simple, effective sabotage. Placed between the rails and wired to a pressure trigger, it required the weight of an oncoming train to complete the circuit. That removed the need for a timer or for the men to linger on the track to watch for headlights. It was a practical decision born of risk management. Set the trap, back away, and let physics do the rest. If the mechanism failed, they still planned a fallback. Sabotage by hand along the railbed to derail a car. But that would cost time and increase the chance of detection. Extraction was another calculated gamble. Barb could wait only until the earliest gray of dawn before submerging to avoid patrol aircraft. The rendezvous point was a reef-lined shadow where the rubber boats could slip out of sight. If the sub had to leave without them, the party faced capture on hostile soil. Every sailor who volunteered accepted that contingency in silence. There is an ethical vector to warfare that becomes sharp when fighting reaches the enemy's homeland. Sabotage is effective because it targets not just material but morale. For Fluckey and his men, destroying a train was not merely a tactical success, and it was a statement. It accused the enemy of vulnerability and reminded both sides that war spared no boundary. Yet moral questions clung to the operation. The men who set the charges were sailors, not soldiers trained for covert land actions. They would be judged differently if captured, by international law and by the Japanese authorities they sought to humiliate. The raid blurred legal and moral categories. Were these lawful combatants acting in military necessity, or agents conducting unlawful sabotage? In 1945, the line was thin and often determined by the will of the captor rather than any neutral tribunal. For the Barb crew, the calculus was pragmatic. The war's logic had already normalized acts that peacetime ethics might condemn. Japanese Americans faced internment. Allied bombing campaigns had reduced cities to ash. Total war had long since altered the moral landscape. Fluckey's men justified the raid as a proportionate act, a small surgical strike intended to reduce supply flow and hasten the end of conflict. They accepted the personal moral burden that came with stepping onto foreign soil with explosives at their feet. The symbolism mattered both at home and abroad. News of a submarine raid on Japanese soil, if it reached Allied ears, would become a tale of audacity. For Japanese civilians, it would be a shock. The idea that the ocean could carry saboteurs to the rails that fed their kitchens and factories. The psychological effect, Fluckey believed, might force reallocation of scarce defensive resources and add another knot of worry to a nation already frayed. At the edge of those choices, tactical, moral, and human, the mission teetered. The men tested the charge's wiring one last time, set their faces to the darkness, and pushed their boats into the cold. Dawn would force a verdict. Either the night's work would pass unnoticed, or the explosion would tear open the quiet and change everything. Night sat heavy over the shore. The rubber boats cut through glassy black water, each stroke careful, rehearsed, almost reverent. 8 silhouettes hugged the low gunwales, oars whispering, breath visible in the cold. The surf spat and withdrew like a living thing. The men hugged the curve of the beach and slipped onto pebbles that bit into their souls. They moved like thieves of the old world, quick, precise, and utterly silent. Sand gave way to scrub and then to a thin path that led inland. The light of the moon kept the world in a gray half-vision. Clouds drifted, hiding them, then showing them in a wash of silver. Every rustle was a possible alarm. Every star could be a watcher. Lieutenant Walker led, holding the folded schematic of the trigger mechanism in his pocket and the weight of the charge already in his pack. The men worked without words. A single whispered count. A hand signal here and there. The language of men who had practiced contingency until it was instinct. The railway lay where Fluckey's scouts had said it would. A dark line cut across the land, rails glinting faintly where moonlight met iron. No lighted stations, no village lamps, only the distant sweep of a shoreline and the shadow of trees. The party approached from the lee of a low dune, keeping their silhouettes against earth, not sky. Placement had to be exact. They slid the 50-pound demolition charge between the rails and braced it against a wooden sleeper. Wires wrapped in waterproof cloth ran to the crude pressure switch they had fashioned. Fingers that had once tightened engine bolts now threaded tiny screws into a makeshift terminal. The work was mechanical and intimate, a soldier's craft married to a sailor's improvisation. The trigger was ingenious in its simplicity. When the steel wheels crossed the rails, they would close a circuit and send current to the detonator. No clock, no remote control. Only the train's own weight would complete the crime. That choice removed the need to linger on the tracks to watch for headlights, but it demanded confidence in the jury-rigged device. One man stayed back as lookout while the others finished. He knelt in shadow, eyes scanning for movement. The light blink of a cigarette, the silhouette of a patrolman, the sweep of a dog's ears. For a moment the world held its breath with him. A gust of wind rattled dry grass. A distant surf bellowed. Nothing moved. With the charge set, the party withdrew to a safe distance, 30, then 50 yards, into a shallow depression below the line of sight. The night felt suddenly too close, as if sound itself might betray them. They huddled, packs hugged to chests, teeth clacking from cold and tension. From the shore, the faint rumble they had trained for began to rise, metal on metal, a rhythmic pulse like a distant heartbeat. The men counted under their breath, soft as prayer. A headlight far off made a thin, waiting line across the horizon. The railbed trembled with the passing of the lead wheels. Dust puffed where ballast met motion. Time seemed to dilate. The first set of wheels crossed. No flash, a second car, then a third. The pressure switch waited like fate, then fought an answer. A bright, terrible bloom tore through the dark. The explosion came with an animal roar, throwing up earth and wood and iron. Sparks stitched the sky. The rails twisted like snapped vines. Plumes of smoke rose and the air filled with the acrid metallic tang of detonated cordite and burning grease. For a moment, everything was noise. The men hit the ground instinctively as secondary fragments rained. Behind them, a distant light began to flare, a searchlight, then another. Somewhere, a dog barked in panicked alarm. The night had been broken. The shore had awakened. They had planned for this. The party moved as one. While some watched for immediate guards racing toward the scene, others sprinted for the path that led back to the rendezvous. Their boots pounded hard on stones that had to be crossed without sounding like drums. The oars were already in place, rubber boats pried against the tide. In the dark, bodies slipped into skiffs and the engine's soft putt began to whisper. Yet nothing in war moves purely by plan. A coastal sentry appeared sooner than expected, a black shape racing across a low rise, cape flapping. He fired a single alarm shot that cracked like thunder, and the reef line ignited with movement. Searchlights blinked and swept. A patrol motorboat answered from a distant cove. The Barb, waiting only within a few hundred yards, was vulnerable if she remained too long. Back aboard the submarine, Fluckey's world tightened to that slit of radio and the rhythm of the ocean. He watched dark shapes fold toward open water, counted heartbeats and read the horizon for aircraft glint. The extraction plan's margin, the thin band between success and capture, began to shrink. The rubber boats hit the swell in a soup of spray. Men leaned hard on oars, lungs burning as the shore tried to give them up to the sea. Each stroke took them farther from soil and closer to steel. A spotlight cut a white blade across the water, missing them by an ocean of luck and precise timing. The patrol boat's wake fanned into white, then faded. Above, a low engine hummed, an aircraft making a pass they had not expected. The Barb's conning tower loomed as a dark monolith. The crew hauled their men aboard with practiced speed. A hand here, a shoulder there, a pull that was muscle memory. The moment any of the party lagged, the choice would be made for them. The submarine would submerge and leave them on enemy soil. But they climbed one by one, each step a tiny defiance against the teeth of danger. Once the last man was aboard, the hatch slammed and seals hissed. The diesel cough of the engine stuttered to life. The Barb backed away from the shore, then turned for open water. Below the surface, the sea swallowed noise and light. For a breathless instant, the men felt both ruin and elation, a violent, combustible pride. The raid had worked. The track was wrecked, a train had been destroyed, and the men who had risked everything were, for now, back under steel and depth. Yet the night's fury had not ended. The explosion had called every nearby defender to action. The Barb now faced new dangers, intensified air patrols, dispatched cutters, and the sharp blade of attention that comes when a homeland is attacked. Their success had been immediate and raw, but the most perilous part of any raid begins the moment escape seems possible. The retreat, the submarine dove. Pressure groaned through her hull as the Barb slipped beneath the surface, leaving a trail of bubbles that were devoured by the night. The crew held their breath listening, for the ping of sonar, for the thump of a depth charge, for anything that meant the Japanese knew they were still here. The sea was no longer a hiding place. It was a trap waiting to close. Inside, the red battle lamps gave everything a bruised glow. Men were soaked, shaking, adrenaline still drowning their nerves. One of the raiders clutched a crucifix around his neck, whispering words meant only for himself. Another stared at his hands blackened with sand and residue from the detonator. They had made history, but history didn't breathe easy under 60 feet of pressure. Commander Eugene Fluckey stood over the navigation table, eyes darting between instruments and the sonar operator. The rhythmic sweep of the sound pulses filled the compartment. He knew the Japanese coastal forces would not take this humiliation quietly. A train destroyed inside the home islands by Americans was an insult that demanded vengeance. Minutes later, the hydrophone operator stiffened. "Screw noise fast, bearing 170. Fluckey's jaw tightened. A patrol craft, maybe more than one. He ordered silent running. Engines died. The hum faded to the faint hiss of ballast. Inside, even breathing felt like a violation. Every man on board became a ghost. The Barb glided through darkness, her propellers turning just enough to maintain trim. Above them, the sea shook. The first depth charge landed 100 yards away, a distant, muffled drumbeat that vibrated through metal. Another followed closer, then another. The Japanese destroyer, guided by sound and fury, began its search pattern. The crew lay still. A bead of condensation rolled down a bulkhead and hit the deck with the sound of a hammer. Nobody moved. They knew one slip, one clank of a wrench or metal buckle could be heard in the stillness of sonar. For nearly half an hour, the barrage continued. Explosions walked closer, until the submarine's frame trembled and dust cascaded from light fittings. Gauges danced under the shock waves. Pipes groaned. Someone muttered, "If that one hits closer, we're done." Fluckey didn't answer. His eyes never left the depth gauge. He ordered the boat to 180 feet, hoping the colder water layer would distort sonar returns. The Barb sank deeper, the sea squeezing tighter with every foot. Silence returned, the kind that isn't peace, but pause. Then came the faint rumble of the destroyer moving on, fooled or giving up. Fluckey waited 10 more minutes before giving the signal to surface. The Barb rose like a slow resurrection, ballast hissing softly. When they broke the surface, the horizon was a pale gray ribbon. Dawn was coming. Smoke still smudged the Japanese coast, a black fingerprint where the train had once run. Through the periscope, Fluckey watched the fading shoreline, the same coast his men had crawled over only hours earlier. He said quietly, "Let's go home." The men didn't cheer. They just looked at one another, exhausted, drained, alive. They knew what they had done would echo louder than any words. By mid-morning, the Barb had cleared the coast and set a course northeast, then turned east for deeper waters. Behind them, radio intercepts confirmed that Japan's coastal command had gone into full alert. Aircraft scoured the sea for the intruder. Patrol boats fanned out across bays. The Empire had been wounded in a place it thought untouchable. Fluckey didn't sleep. He stayed by the chart room, plotting new courses, keeping the sub unpredictable. At 1400 hours, a Japanese reconnaissance plane passed within 2 miles of their position. The crew heard its engines fading, then returning. Fluckey ordered an immediate crash dive. The ocean closed over them once again. Below, they drifted silent. Conserving battery and waiting for darkness to return, the air grew heavy with diesel fumes and sweat. Men dozed where they sat, still in damp clothes. One of the saboteurs, Seaman Paul Saunders, later said it was the longest day of his life. Not the explosion, not the landing, but that long, suffocating wait to know if they had truly escaped. By nightfall, the sky cleared. The submarine surfaced again, engines roaring softly to life. The men climbed topside in turns, breathing clean air for the first time in almost a day. Someone pointed back toward the west, where a faint orange glow still marked the coast of Karafuto. The mission's proof burned there, visible even from miles out. Fluckey recorded the event in his logbook with the brevity of a man who knew history didn't need embellishment. Landed 8 men on enemy shore. Planted demolition charge on train track. Result, train destroyed. All hands returned safely. No other entry in the Pacific War carried such quiet power. It was the first and only time American forces landed on Japanese home soil and struck directly at its transportation network. As Barb moved farther into open ocean, her signal intelligence confirmed what they'd feared and hoped. Japanese broadcasts reported an enemy landing party, sabotage by infiltrators, and railway explosion near Hokkaido. The Empire had been forced to admit vulnerability, and for Fluckey, that was the point. Not just the explosion, the message it sent. Japan's fortress was no longer unbreachable. The war was shifting, and psychological warfare mattered as much as torpedoes. The Barb turned southeast, heading back toward the safer zones of the Pacific. The men who had walked on enemy soil watched the stars wheel overhead, each one a tiny reminder of how thin the line between life and legend could be. When dawn came again, the horizon was empty. The danger had passed, but the memory of that night, of the surf, the moonlight, the explosion that shattered Japan's illusion of safety, would never fade. The impossible raid was complete, and now, in the quiet after the storm, the world would begin to feel its consequences. News of the attack didn't explode across headlines. Not yet. It arrived as a whisper, coded and clipped, sent from one command center to another. USS Barb reports successful sabotage mission. Enemy train destroyed. All men accounted for. For Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. Pacific Submarine Fleet, it was more than another patrol success. It was a message written in bold defiance that the war's frontiers were no longer defined by coastlines or distance. An American submarine had not only struck Japan's shipping and war industry, it had landed men on Japanese soil and left destruction behind. The Pacific had always been Japan's shield. The empire's propaganda called the home islands inviolable, a sacred space protected by divine winds and vast distance. Fluckey and his crew had shattered that illusion in a single night. Within days, U.S. intelligence began intercepting frantic Japanese communications. Reports described enemy commandos on the coast, increased patrols across Hokkaido and Karafuto, and confusion over how such an operation could have been carried out. The Japanese Navy suspected a small infiltration craft. Few imagined a full-sized American submarine could have been responsible. For the men aboard Barb, the magnitude of what they'd done took time to sink in. The mission had felt like survival, not legend. Only when Lockwood's congratulatory message arrived, "That's the most daring act of the war," did they realize the Navy would remember them differently. The Barb's log became sacred text among submariners. Fluckey's crew had already been known for pushing the limits. Surface attacks on convoys, shore bombardments at point-blank range, and torpedo runs that defied standard doctrine. But this mission transcended naval warfare. It was part espionage, part psychological strike, part audacious theater. In Pearl Harbor, officers gathered in silence to read the after-action report. The details seemed impossible. 8 men in rubber, boats a homemade charge, a train blasted from its rails. But the evidence was irrefutable. Japanese broadcasts, reconnaissance photos, and the wreckage confirmed the feat. Among the Japanese high command, the reaction was immediate and furious. Local garrisons along the northern coast were ordered to double patrols. Civilians were questioned, curfews imposed. The Home Ministry issued directives for greater vigilance against enemy sabotage groups. Even the Imperial Navy began reinforcing coastal defenses that had been previously neglected. Yet beneath the official outrage there was something deeper: unease. The Barb had demonstrated that Japan's war perimeter had collapsed inward. What had once been a distant battle fought in the Philippines or the Solomons had now touched the homeland itself. For a nation built on the promise of invincibility, that realization was catastrophic. Fluckey himself received the news of the raid's success with quiet pride. He didn't boast, didn't dramatize. His focus, as always, was on his men. They were the reason he had planned every detail so meticulously, so that not one of them would die in vain heroics. Weeks later, Barb returned to port to a subdued but knowing reception. The men looked like any other crew, tired, sunburned, hollow-eyed from months underwater. But among them, 8 carried the secret of having stepped onto enemy soil and returned. They were not given medals right away, not paraded in front of cameras. Secrecy was still vital. But word spread quietly through naval circles. The Barb had done the impossible and survived it. In later years, the Navy would call the operation the only ground combat carried out on Japan's home islands by U.S. forces. For the crew, that phrase carried an odd poetry. They hadn't fought a battle in the traditional sense, no bullets, no bayonets, yet their mission struck harder than artillery. It attacked the mind of the enemy. But the war wasn't over. Even as the Barb's men celebrated, new orders arrived. There were convoys to hunt, ports to stalk, more missions waiting in the endless blue. Still, something had changed. In the crew, in their commander, and in the way the Navy saw what was possible beneath the waves. The Barb's name now stood for more than victory. It stood for imagination, for the audacity to fight a war in ways the enemy never expected. And soon, the rest of the world would see just how far that imagination could reach. The Barb slipped back into the Pacific, a shadow among shadows, but her legend had already taken root. Word of the train raid traveled quietly at first, shared in hushed tones between submarine crews at Midway, Guam, and Pearl. Within weeks, it had become naval folklore. Sailors told the story like a secret prayer, how 8 men, armed with a homemade bomb, had crept onto Japan's own soil and returned without a single casualty. It was a tale that lifted morale across the Pacific Fleet, proof that even at the enemy's doorstep, American daring could turn fear into laughter. The operation's symbolism was enormous. By mid-1945, Japan was cornered, its navy crippled, its cities bombed, its army retreating across Asia. But the Japanese people had been told one thing relentlessly, that the sacred home islands were untouchable. The emperor's realm was beyond invasion, beyond desecration. The Barb's explosion shattered that myth. Psychological warfare experts later described the event as a tremor in the nation's spine. It wasn't just a train destroyed, it was the illusion of safety. It told every citizen, soldier, and bureaucrat that the war had reached their own backyard. No propaganda could erase the image of that wrecked line, twisted steel against Japanese soil. Inside Japan, rumors spread faster than the official censors could contain them. Locals along the Hokkaido coast swore they had seen American commandos in black uniforms. Others claimed it had been Chinese partisans or Soviet infiltrators. The uncertainty bred paranoia. Patrols increased, curfews tightened, and suspicion hung heavy over small fishing villages. In the United States, the story remained classified for months. Only when victory was declared did it reach the public in full. Newspapers finally ran headlines. U.S. submarine crew blows up Japanese train. For a war-weary nation, it was the perfect punctuation mark to years of struggle, a small, audacious act that captured the spirit of the American fighting man. Commander Eugene B. Fluckey received the Medal of Honor for his leadership and valor, though not for the train raid alone, but for the Barb's extraordinary patrol record, sinking enemy ships in shallow waters, rescuing prisoners, and redefining what submarines could achieve. His men were decorated too. 4 Navy Crosses, 40 Silver Stars, and a long list of commendations. When reporters later asked him about the train mission, Fluckey downplayed his own role. He simply said it was the crew. I gave the orders, but they made it real. That humility became part of his legend. The 8 men who landed on Japanese soil were later identified publicly, each given commendations and quiet fame among submariners. Yet they rarely spoke of the raid in detail. For them, the memory wasn't about glory. It was about fear, cold, precision, and the surreal silence before the blast. After the war, the Barb was decommissioned and later scrapped, a fate common to wartime vessels once their battles were over. But her conning tower was preserved, and today it stands as a memorial in Groton, Connecticut, the home of the U.S. Submarine Force. Etched into the steel are the submarine's confirmed sinkings, and one unique symbol: train. No other submarine in history has earned that mark. Fluckey retired as a rear admiral and spent his later years teaching leadership and innovation. He often told young officers that there's always a way to do the impossible. You just have to look for it. Historians still regard the Barb's mission as one of the most daring acts of individual initiative in naval history. It embodied everything the Pacific War had taught: courage under uncertainty, the blending of human ingenuity and technical skill, and the idea that war's outcome depends not only on power, but on imagination. For Japan, the raid faded into the background of larger tragedies: atomic fire and unconditional surrender. But to those who studied the campaign, that one small explosion on the northern coast remained a signal that the war was already lost, even before the bombs fell. And for those who survived it, the sound of that explosion, the blast that tore through steel, night, and fear, would echo for the rest of their lives. It was not just the end of a mission. It was the moment America proved that even in the vastness of the Pacific, no place was truly safe from resolve and invention. The Barb had rewritten the limits of submarine warfare, and in doing so, wrote herself into eternity. War is remembered for its great battles, for Midway's burning skies, Normandy's beaches, Stalingrad's frozen streets, yet sometimes it is a quiet act in the dark that defines courage most clearly. The USS Barb's raid was not about firepower. It was about imagination, about men who refused to accept that the ocean set their limits. In an age when submarines were meant to strike from the depths and vanish, Fluckey and his crew turned theirs into a vessel of invention, capable of waging war on land, sea, and mind. It's easy to measure victory in tonnage sunk or enemies destroyed. Harder to measure are the ripples of an idea that even in the bleakest chapters of conflict, human ingenuity remains limitless. The Barb's train raid didn't change the war's course by itself, but it changed how men believed they could fight it. It showed that strategy could still be art, and that audacity could still be moral when guided by purpose. For Japan, the explosion on that lonely track was a whisper before the storm, a reminder that no wall, no ocean, no island could protect an empire built on illusion. For the United States, it was proof that its sons, even in exhaustion and loss, could find new ways to defy fear. When the crew of the Barb finally returned home, there were no parades, no cameras, just men who had seen what the edge of courage looked like and had come back from it. In later years, when they gathered for reunions, they rarely spoke of the train or the mission's danger. Instead, they spoke of the sound of the oars, the stillness of the beach, and the strange beauty of that night when war met invention. History is built not only by those who fight with power, but by those who dare to imagine differently. And on that July night in 1945, deep in enemy waters, one American submarine proved that the line between impossible and possible is drawn not by circumstance, but by the courage to cross it.